The Protestant Reformation had profound social and political consequences, many of which became most visible during the 1520s. Although Lutheranism began as a popular movement embraced by many levels of German society, most ordinary Germans did not fully understand Luther's theological arguments. This misunderstanding helped trigger one of the most dramatic uprisings in early modern Europe. In 1524, peasants in southwestern Germany, misinterpreting Luther's teachings on Christian freedom, concluded that spiritual freedom also meant freedom from feudal obligations. Luther had argued that Christians were free in their hearts, but the peasants interpreted this to mean they should no longer have to pay dues or work for their lords. The misunderstanding escalated quickly. The revolt spread rapidly across central Germany as peasants demanded an end to feudal obligations. Violence erupted, and many peasants killed lords and their families and burned manor houses. By 1525, the revolt reached Wittenberg, where Luther lived. Initially, Luther sympathized with the peasants' grievances. He believed that lords frequently treated peasants unjustly. However, Luther also believed strongly in the social hierarchy of his time. As the violence escalated and the revolt threatened his own region, Luther turned fiercely against the rebels. He wrote on of his most shocking pamphlets, "Against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants." In it, he urged German nobles to knock down, strangle, and stab rebellious peasants, serve as both judge and executioner, and restore order through brutal force. Luther even wrote that a prince could earn more favor with God by shedding the rebels' blood than by praying. This harsh language was inconsistent with his earlier beliefs, but Luther was an emotional, passionate writer, not always consistent or systematic. In 1525, the fragile alliance between reform and popular unrest shattered in dramatic and violent fashion. When peasant revolts erupted across German territories, fueled in part by grievances over economic hardship and inspired by the language of religious reform, the German princes responded with overwhelming force. The uprisings were crushed with extraordinary brutality, leaving tens of thousands dead and making clear that social revolution would not be tolerated. The consequences of this suppression were profound. In its aftermath, Lutheranism ceased to function as a broad, grassroots movement that spoke to the hopes of ordinary people. Instead, it became increasingly tied to the authority and interests of territorial rulers. Martin Luther himself, who had condemned the revolts and urged princes to restore order, came to be seen less as a radical reformer and more as a defender of the existing social and political structure. Disillusioned, many among the common people turned away from Lutheranism. They sought alternative forms of Protestant expression that seemed more aligned with their desires for deeper change. Movements such as the Anabaptists and later the Calvinists, which often challenged both religious and social hierarchies more directly. At the same time, the German princes grew closer to Luther and his teachings. Recognizing the stability and authority his ideas could support, they became his strongest allies. In the wake of 1525, the Reformation shifted decisively. No longer driven from below by popular enthusiasm, it was now sustained and shaped from above by political power. Most princes did not support Lutheranism out of theological conviction. Their motives, though varied, had important similarities to those of ordinary Germans. Economic concerns played a powerful role in shaping the course of the Reformation, especially among both ordinary people and the ruling elite. For many Germans, there had long been resentment toward the steady flow of money from their lands to Rome. Payments for indulgences, church fees, and various taxes were seen as a drain on local wealth, benefiting a distant papacy rather than the communities that produced it. While common people resented this outflow, the princes who governed them were even more frustrated by the loss of resources and control. Lutheranism offered a practical solution to these grievances. By breaking with the Catholic Church, princes could immediately halt the financial obligations that had tied their territories to Rome. No longer required to send money to the papacy, they retained those funds for their own use, strengthening their treasuries and increasing their independence. Even more significantly, they gained the opportunity to seize church property within their domains. Monasteries, lands, and other ecclesiastical holdings, once under the authority of the Church, could be absorbed into princely control. These assets added substantially to the economic power of the state. In addition, princes could redirect the tithe, the traditional 10% tax paid by the faithful, to themselves or to state-controlled churches. What had once supported the Catholic Church now reinforced local authority. In this way, economic motives became deeply intertwined with religious change. Lutheranism was not only a matter of belief, it was also a means of reshaping the flow of wealth and power within the Holy Roman Empire, further strengthening the position of those rulers who chose to embrace it. Many secular rulers in the Holy Roman Empire had long harbored ambitions that extended beyond purely political governance. They sought greater control over their own territories, especially the ability to appoint local officials without interference, and aimed to reduce the long-standing influence of the Catholic Church. At the same time, they wanted to strengthen their authority, not only in secular matters, but also in the religious life of their states. The teachings of Martin Luther helped make these ambitions a reality. Luther argued that the ruler of each territory should also serve as the head of that territory's church, a concept that broke sharply from the traditional authority of the Pope. By transferring religious leadership from Rome to local rulers, this idea provided a powerful justification for expanding princely control. In practice, it greatly increased the authority of German princes. They could now oversee church appointments, manage church lands and revenues, and shape religious practice within their domains. What had once been separate spheres, church and state, became closely intertwined, reinforcing the power of rulers and accelerating the transformation of political authority during the Reformation. Although some rulers were genuinely persuaded by the theological arguments of Luther and his followers, such cases were relatively rare. For most German princes, the appeal of Lutheranism lay less in doctrine than in its practical advantages. Embracing the new faith provided them with clear political and economic benefits. It allowed them to seize church lands and revenues, strengthen their control over religious institutions within their territories, and reduce their dependence on the authority of Rome. In this sense, the spread of Lutheranism often followed the interests of rulers rather than the convictions of their subjects. A territory typically became Lutheran only when its prince chose to adopt the faith. Where rulers remained loyal to Catholicism, Lutheran ideas were suppressed, sometimes harshly. Those who persisted in Protestant beliefs often faced a difficult choice, either to conform outwardly to Catholic practices or to leave their homes in search of more tolerant lands. As a result, the religious map of the Holy Roman Empire came to reflect political boundaries rather than purely spiritual divisions, with the faith of entire populations determined largely by the decisions of their rulers.